this is the situation we find ourselves in for now. So, right. So after the two-party conventions, and really this week, or maybe we would say next week, after the Labor Day holiday on Monday, is what is really considered the most intense homestretch period of the campaign. And I think we can say a couple of things about where things stand after the two-party conventions. Um, Really, quite consistently since about May, maybe into June of this year, it has been the case that Joe Biden, once he consolidated the nomination on the Democratic side, um, has held in most national polls a significant lead over Donald Trump, something in the 6 to 10 point range. That really has been consistent. It's had minor fluctuations, and of course, there are outlying polls, but the averages tend to stay within that range. And it's also fairly consistent with what we have seen about President Trump through most of his presidency, in fact, is that he has a very dedicated core of support, which is in the 41 to 42% range, or maybe ranges from the high 30s to the low mid 40% range, but almost never ever goes above that. Hasn't gone much below that during this period, but also has not risen. And there is a small majority, 51, 52%, they don't all call themselves Biden voters, but who disapprove of his performance and who also seem immovable on that view. And as the two main issues, well, I say three main issues that have really captured the public's attention over the course of the summer, the COVID-19 pandemic and the inability of the United States as a whole to kind of get it under control. We're now over 180,000 deaths in the United States, and we'll probably hit 200,000 in another week or two. And the economic crisis that has accompanied that, even though there has been some regain of some of the jobs lost, it's still a near record high unemployment, 10, 11% higher than any time in the financial crisis, really any time since the Great Depression. And the racial justice protests that followed the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, and the Black Lives Matter movement and the counter protests and some of the competing narratives around that, whether these are peaceful protests, mostly they are, whether there are also violent elements who loot or who destroy property, and that has also been the case, and then the counter narratives that is the dominant strain, the violence, which is really not, and people coming to the defense of the police from the more extreme movement or calls to defund the police or otherwise treat all police as if they are the enemy. And in all of those three issues, through the summer, Trump did very, very poorly. His ratings showed that people thought he wasn't handling the pandemic well, that he was starting to take on blame where he had previously had some credit for the economic downturn, although that may have buoyed him a little bit because people saw him perhaps as the one who might have the better chance of digging the U.S. out of the economic hole it's in. And people really didn't respond well to his response to the racial justice protests, which had an element of race baiting in them. That might be the most gentle way to say it. But whenever he would say something or be praised by people who were really very unsympathetic to the plight of Black Americans who really don't feel safe in the hands of law enforcement, people responded extremely poorly to that. And so that was how we went into conventions, and Biden sort of benefited by sounding very statesmanlike on the same issues. In the convention, I think, the two conventions, I think the Democratic convention, of course, they all had to rethink what is a convention in the era of COVID when you can't gather in a hall and it's all done online and all done on television. But I think the Democratic convention tried very hard to convey those themes of Trump's failed leadership and Biden's preparation to step in with plans on each of those issues, and to tell the stories about Biden as a person, his empathy, how he's responded to tragedies in his own life, to empathize with the hardships of others, how he has served in a very professional and dedicated way through a long career, and is ready to help dig the United States out of these holes, versus Trump, who got us into it and doesn't have the tools or the character to get us out of it. The Republican convention was quite interesting in that they spent a lot of time telling a story about Donald Trump, which is really not the story we normally think about him. That he is understanding, that he is empathetic, that he is caring about staff and the little guy, and so forth. That's not the Donald Trump who we normally see on display. And already in the days since, his own conduct on Twitter and the own way he talks in the interviews and the press availabilities he does reminds people of that same very aggressive, very harsh, almost cruel kind of style of politics that he's better associated with. Somewhat undercuts the message of the Trump of the convention. And the other thing they did, and they probably had more success here, was to try to paint these protests as a sign of out of control crime, something that really might scare suburban voters who have been drifting away from Trump and toward Biden, but seem to be unnerved by the amount of looting, by the amount of violence that's taking place in the streets. There was this particular incident in Kenosha, Wisconsin, following the shooting of a black man by police 7 times in the back when he was unarmed, and then some protests and riots and some violence and property destruction, all happening during the convention. And the Republican convention's theme was that's going to happen in spades, on steroids, if Joe Biden is elected, because he is really a tool in the hands of the far left, and he won't stand up to the violence. So what Biden has done over the last 2 or 3 days has really been to, in a very aggressive way, not a defensive way, double down by saying, actually, I am the candidate who is against all violence, no matter who it comes from, whether it comes from, the side of the political fence that I sit on, or whether it comes from the other side. I also stand for racial justice and the right of peaceful protests and so on. But it's Trump who is too weak to stand up to the extremists on his side, and that when people will go into some of these cities where there are protests, and they will come brandishing Trump flags and weapons and try to start confrontations. And of course, in Kenosha, there was one such individual who's now being charged with murder for 2 protesters that he killed. That shows Trump's inability to respond to this. But I think that is the big struggle in the narrative at the moment. There is some evidence, although the polling doesn't show a massive shift, but there's some evidence that even if the overall numbers haven't changed in terms of the head-to-head matchup, it's still 6 to 8 point Biden lead, that more voters are concerned about the violence within the protests than were before. And there is somewhat less sympathy for the Black Lives Matter cause than there was in May and June after the George Floyd murder. If that continues, that could start to cut into Biden's support. But of course, and I'll close with this, the national number is of course not so relevant. As we all know, it's an electoral college competition. It's state by state. There's about 6 or 7 or 8 at most swing states that could determine the outcome of the election. In almost all of those, Biden maintains a smaller lead than his national lead, call it 3 to 5 points, maybe 6 in a couple of them. But in most of them, it shows that it does appear to be tightening a little bit. This was never really unexpected. It's always likely that Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, you can add Arizona and North Carolina to that list, and perhaps 1 or 2 others, will be very close and very competitive. And so a Biden lead in May and June in the 6 to 8 points in those states was probably never realistic down the stretch. So I think where we are is where we sort of expected to be, a very competitive election, very hard fought in the swing states, with Trump carrying a lot of the baggage he's carried, but perhaps finding an opening to try to swing back toward him some of these key swing voters, suburban voters, white non-college educated voters, who have been drifting toward Biden in the last 3 or 4 months and try to pull them back into the Republican fold.
Okay, great. Following up on that, do you think, what do you expect to be the impact of the events surrounding Black Lives Matter and on the forthcoming election? Do you think this will get the non-white Americans out to vote?
Well, it's a fascinating question and one we don't know. It's hard to understand what brings people to vote and what doesn't. When Obama was running in 2008, I think he got something like 5 million more votes than Hillary Clinton got in 2000. I'm not sure if that's right. There was something like a fall off of 5 million voters when from his victory to Clinton's victory. And so obviously those are people who, if they were to show up, would have been inclined, we think, to vote for Clinton, and there needs to be a way of getting these voters back. And certainly one hears within minority communities a belief that this is a critical election, that if it's, with all of these very public and very prominent painful cases of police violence against minorities taking place, if in that moment people won't actually show up to vote, it's hard to know when they would show up to vote. Having said that, President Trump even made a pitch in the convention to try to peel off at least a small number of black voters, probably mostly male black voters, with the testimonials of some people who know him, black people who know him, who say he's not racist. It's wrong to call him racist, and to try to give people permission. I think that's actually more focused on white voters who don't want to vote for a racist president and need the testimonials of black people to do so. But there might be a small slippage there. But the big question is always, and this is always a struggle for the Democratic side, is can all of these people be registered? Because it's a two-stage process. First, you have to register to vote, and in some states, it's quite cumbersome process to do that in the best of times, and in COVID times, when offices may not be open, when people are staying home more, it's harder still. And then the question, after you're registered, will you vote? And that too is potentially affected by COVID. As I think everybody's probably aware, there is a big push to have mail-in voting, as many states have permitted for a long time, but not all states, or some states have only done it on a very limited basis. But because of the fear that people have of infection if they go to stand in line to vote, and unfortunately because of the reduction in the number of polling places, both by choice, by legislatures who actually want to limit voting opportunities, and by the fact that many poll workers are older voters, or older citizens, who are really, it's not safe for them to do that during COVID. We may simply have fewer places for people to vote. And so if you're going to actually vote in person, you may end up waiting in line for hours, absolutely hours, which is not efficient, really not a just way of protecting someone's right to vote, and obviously not necessarily safe and healthy, and may discourage some people from voting at all. So then there's the big question of, can all of these people be educated to know how to do the registration online, to get the ballot, absentee ballot, to mail it in, and will it arrive on time? And here there's a lot of concern that President Trump has installed at the head of the post office, the U.S. Postal Service, a political donor of his, who has put in place some changes in procedures that have actually dramatically slowed the arrival of mail from days to a couple of weeks in some cases. And if that means that if there's a surge of ballots being sent by the mail and they don't arrive on time, and then there's a dispute in various states, and every state has different rules about whether or not the ballots that came in on election day or after election day should be counted, you could have a very, very deep split about what the actual correct count of this election is. It's not impossible to imagine a situation where we end up weeks after the election with an unsettled outcome, weeks, as different states litigate and fight it out in their own legislatures and courts about which ballots should be counted, and the margins are such that the number of mail-in ballots uncounted still that they're fighting over is larger than the margin that whoever is leading at the time is. and that will affect the electoral votes of that state. This could drag for out in November, it could drag into December, and there are scenarios where it can drag all the way to January. And it's quite unnerving because it could leave us in a situation where almost regardless of the outcome, a significant part, close to half the country, views the outcome as illegitimate and essentially as a stolen election.
Really, given that half the country thinks their votes will not be fully counted due to deliberate sabotaging of the U.S. Postal Service by the current administration, and that the other half are made to believe by the president that any mail-in vote for Biden will be fraudulent, are we witnessing the end of the USA democracy as we know it and the seeds of a new civil war? Do you think this is an exaggeration?
Look, I don't want to be overly pessimistic, and I don't want to buy into the worst possible case scenarios as likely scenarios. But I have to say, the potential for what you just described is real. The potential for this election to end in such chaos and such open dispute about what the actual outcome was that really half the country doesn't accept it as a legitimate outcome is quite worrying and would be just hugely damaging. It's not comparable to the 2000 recount of the George Bush-Al Gore race. That came down to one state. It came down to the dispute about which ballots to count in that state, some bad ballot design problems, and there was a perfect storm of problems in that one state. But in the end, it went through a certain legal process and it worked its way up to the courts. And at the end of the day, the Supreme Court rendered a judgment. I disagreed with that judgment. Most Democrats I know disagreed with that judgment. Certainly Al Gore disagreed with that judgment, but people accepted it. And Al Gore himself, I think, deserves enormous credit for, in that moment, saying, look, I think it's a terrible decision, but we have no other system, and our court has reached this outcome, and I have to accept it. And therefore, there were lots of people who felt that George Bush didn't really win, and of course he didn't win the popular vote, and he shouldn't have won the electoral vote, and it was an accidental president, that he was not a good president. But there were very, very few people who said he was illegitimately in office, that he had actually no right to hold that office. Certainly that was not the widespread feeling. What the scenario you described, Svika, is one where it probably means multiple states went haywire, and there's disputes about the counts in multiple states. It's, I think, possible. I don't think it's likely, but it certainly is possible. And even to the point where each state decides how to appoint its own electors, you could actually have a situation where the count appears to favor one candidate, but the legislature, controlled by the party of the other candidate, can overrule the count and say, we are going to select electors on a different basis, and we will send those electors to Washington. And when the Electoral College meets, there's actually a dispute about which is the correct slate of electors. And if you had that in 2, 3, 4 states, and that's the difference in the outcome of the election, you could really end up in a situation where people don't accept it as a legitimate outcome. And then, one really does have to worry about faith in the system, certainly protests for sure, and protests that devolve into some kind of violence for sure. Very, very worrying scenarios. I mean, if it's going to be close, we might end up in one, again, regardless of the outcome, we might end up in that situation. And I, personally think there's a lot of evidence that Trump is trying to game this system exactly that way. I don't think there's anywhere near the kind of evidence to say that Biden is. If Biden were to win, let's say, a landslide, which is also possible. It's a scenario that's possible where it's not possible to come up with a scenario that enough states counts were wrong and could be swung back, that Trump can salvage it. Then I don't think we will face that. Of course, it will be necessary at some point for Trump to concede, and for other Republicans, this is critical to say, Mr. President, you lost. It's time to move on. So far, there's not a lot of inspiring hope about that, because they generally don't stand up to his excesses and violations of norms that he did in the impeachment trial. and they didn't in the convention. He held the last night of the convention on the White House lawn, which is, I think, by any stretch of the imagination, a violation of the longstanding practice and law, the Hatch Act it's called, not to use federal facilities for political events. Al Gore, when he was the vice president in the Clinton administration, got a big mini scandal. At the time, it seemed like a big scandal. Now it seems quaint that he may have made a couple of fundraising phone calls on a cell phone while inside the White House compound. And that was considered a scandalous violation of the Hatch Act. Well, this was a nationally televised major political party event on the White House grounds, and no Republican said a word about it. And when Democrats said a word about it, they were like, no one cares about that. Well, that might be true, but it's a bad sign if our norms and our laws are deemed so malleable. So those are scenarios that could feed this the outcome that you described. But I hope that's not where we end up.
What do you think of Mike Pompeo's speaking from Jerusalem, which was also sort of like using symbols that usually are not used in the campaigns like this?
Yeah, also a terrible violation of longstanding norms and probably laws and certainly State Department rules. There was a memo that he himself signed to State Department employees a month earlier, just a month before the convention, making clear the longstanding prohibition on any State Department official even attending a political party convention, much less speaking in a political way. Foreign service officers, and I held to this as when I was ambassador. I was a career foreign service, even though I was a political appointee of the Obama administration. Everybody knew what my political affiliations were, but I didn't say a word in the 2012 election or the 2016 election about my political preferences. I didn't attend the party convention those years. Well, he's a Secretary of State. His own rules, as he wrote them out, prohibit it, and he did it anyway. I don't know what to make of that. It's just there's really no justification for it whatsoever. Again, lots of people said, these are small inside baseball Washington Beltway concerns. Nobody out there really cares, and it's possible that nobody out there really cares. But it's a bad sign when our public officials don't consider the rules that they set for others to bind them. There's a separate concern about him doing that in that he did it. And I should say there's no precedent within at least the last 80 years of a sitting Secretary of State to speak at a party convention. They often go around the world to be as far away from a convention as possible to make sure they don't get dragged into that. There's a separate concern about that speech is that he did from Israel. Israel has generally benefited from the fact that it has been considered for years a point of bipartisan consensus in the United States, a point where there's strong support in both political parties and both administrations of both parties. Doesn't change that much when there's a new administration, and the both houses of Congress have changed hands, and yet the core elements of the relationship have been sustained. And so there's a certain way we have tended to conduct ourselves around the issue of Israel to try to sustain that reality. That's not how President Trump does it. He instrumentalizes Israel as a tool for his own partisan political purposes. And here again was the Secretary of State, generally above that sort of thing, dragging Israel into partisan politics. Mostly, by the way, don't think of targeting Jewish voters. Mostly, I think targeting evangelical voters. That seems to be, and Trump's been pretty open about that. He said, "Oh yeah, we moved the embassy. That was for the evangelicals." That's a direct quote from about 2 weeks ago. Pompeo may, of course, want to do favors for Trump, but he also has his own eye on a run for the presidency. He seems likely to compete in the Republican primaries, regardless of the outcome of this year's in 2024. And so, Israel's now just another thing that a politician or aspiring politician can use to try to improve their own prospects without regard to what impact that has on the stability of this relationship over time and as administrations come and go.
So do you think the Jewish vote at this election will matter, will be able to make a difference like it did in previous elections?
I'm actively involved in doing some Jewish outreach in support of the campaign. By the way, I don't speak for the Biden campaign. I have no official role, but I certainly support Biden publicly and try to be helpful in lots of ways. And that's one of them, is trying to work on Jewish outreach. And it matters. I sometimes think we tend to overstate its impact of the Jewish vote. After all, it's 2% of the population. It's a somewhat higher percent of the electorate because Jews vote in higher numbers than non-Jews generally. But in a very close, hard-fought state-by-state election, it most certainly can have an impact, along with lots of other things. In Florida, there's about 600,000 Jewish residents, let's say about 400,000 voters if you take out underage people. And, 10% of that is 40,000 votes. And typically the range of the Jewish vote is somewhere between 65% and 75% for the Democratic Party candidate. Sometimes it's a little higher. Sometimes it pushes up toward 80%, but typically it's in the 70 to 75 range, but it can go plus or minus 5 to 10 points. Well, that's, if that swing from 65 to 75% is 40,000 votes. In Pennsylvania, maybe it's 20,000 votes. In Michigan and Ohio, it's probably 10 to 12,000 votes. Well, we all know that there have been elections in all of these states, and especially in Florida, that have been decided by well less than that number. There have been, Al Gore lost Florida by 497 votes. And my former boss, Bill Nelson, in 2018, lost a Senate race in Florida by a few single-digit thousand votes. So 40,000 votes is a big deal. And if there are, this is not an election that's going to be decided by the Jewish vote. I don't think we should mistake what this election is about. It's about COVID. It's about the economy. It's about racial justice. It's about the leadership that people feel we need. And most Jewish voters vote on those issues like other American voters. Some will prioritize Israel in a different way, but that's a pretty small number, although it may be a higher percentage of that swing, of that potential 10% swing of the vote may be more focused on Israel. So, as somebody who's working in that community, my view is in a close election, especially a state-by-state close election, you don't want to leave any vote to chance. Because if, based on all those other factors and all of those other places where votes are swinging this way and that way, it ends up coming down to an election that's going to be decided by less than 10,000 votes in that state, and the Jewish vote can swing plus or minus 20,000 votes, I sure don't want to leave anything on the table.
There you go. Let's try to talk a little bit about the annexation. First, is it of any interest in the elections? I assume not, but what happened to it? Was it like a tool at the beginning to get the evangelic vote? And what do you think is gonna happen with it going forth now?
Well, this is one of the good news stories of the recent weeks, and it's a two-part good news, and we'll talk about the other part, which is the normalization with the UAE. But the good news is that annexation is off the table, and it's well off the table. I don't think we should be confused by some of the spin around that it's on hold or it's suspended or it could come back with the support of the U.S. Certainly that's not going to happen anytime soon. How did we get into this story with annexation? I guess you have to go back to the April 2019 election in Israel, when Netanyahu, who in his entire career had never supported annexation, and I sat in many conversations where he told me why he opposed annexation and why he would argue against it to colleagues in the Likud party who favored it, to ensure Israel retains its Jewish and democratic character. A week before the April 2019 election, decided to come out for annexation. I really try not to get deeply involved in Israeli politics, so I'll maybe withhold any further commentary on what it means for a politician to change a long-standing position a week before an election. People can draw their own conclusions. And then he doubled and tripled down on that in the next two elections without ever really having any statement from the Trump administration about it. Then in January, leading up to the third election in Israel, the Trump plan was announced, and it contained this notional map and this idea of Israel keeping 30% of the West Bank. And there's lots of ways of interpreting, what motivated that plan, who was involved in writing it, who it was intended to appeal to, what, the theory of the case of that version of, for the first time, Trump used the phrase two-state solution, although I don't think it's a legitimate use of the term. It's not really a two-state outcome. But it then immediately opened up a dispute within the Trump administration about whether or not Israel could front load the annexation before accepting the rest of the plan and before the negotiations would commence. And one part of the Trump administration seemed to say, yeah, give a signal to Israel, and this was Netanyahu's original position, go ahead and annex right away. And the other part said, wait, let's try if we can build some support in the Arab world for this plan, and annexation could hurt us on that, and at least wait till after the election, and at least wait till the government is established. So that they went through that in the spring. In May, the government was established. Netanyahu had an ability to bring annexation up in the government after July 1st, even without Gantz's approval. And so even though Blue and White did not have the veto according to the coalition agreement, it was interesting that the administration kind of gave them back the veto, because the coalition agreement also says that annexation could only come up if it had the approval of the U.S. And the U.S. officials made clear that they wanted it to only come up if there was a consensus in the Israeli cabinet. So that gave Gantz and Ashkenazi some leverage, which I think they used to at least slow the train down. But it was only in June and July that this alternative path emerged, which was to go for this normalization agreement instead. If you probably recall that in June, about the third week of June, the UAE ambassador in Washington, his name is Yusuf Al-Otaiba, published an op-ed in Yediot Ahronot in Hebrew on a Friday morning, also in English on the Ynet website. He's someone I know well and have worked with and even talked to about this article before he published it. And it was a clear effort on behalf of his government to hold out a hand and say, and he said this very straightforwardly in the article in very respectful language, UAE sees Israel no longer as an enemy, but as an opportunity. We see great possibilities through normalization and cooperation and obviously security, but also technology and tourism and trade and many other fields. And we see that as a real possibility. But you Israelis should know that that's incompatible with annexation. You can't have annexation and normalization. So it's one or the other, and you'll have to make that choice. And I think that had a very significant impact on the Israeli conversation over the next several days. But it was interesting because until then, it was not really a discussion point that could have been seen as the off-ramp to annexation. Now, there are various theories that Netanyahu was looking for an off-ramp. He knows that with all the opposition, obviously from the Palestinians, but also Jordan, also Arab states, also Europe, also Democrats, Joe Biden and virtually every Democrat in Congress has expressed opposition to it. So if Biden wins, Trump's support for annexation wouldn't necessarily be sustained, that he might have been looking for an off-ramp. We don't know. It sure felt like, and he was sure saying to various constituencies that he was serious about it. But it was only after that article was published that a conversation began between first Al-Otaiba and Jared Kushner, and eventually his senior leaders in UAE and the White House. And only in the second or third week of July was the Israeli side brought into that conversation. And there were different discussions about how this could be structured. I think originally the UAE had in mind to do something lower than full normalization, maybe what's called a non-belligerency agreement. But in the end, with the Israeli advocacy for it and the White House support, I think the UAE said, look, this is where we're going to end up anyway. We have interests that can be advanced by improving this relationship. And in addition to advancing those interests, we see a real win here in getting normalization, getting annexation really taken off the table and buried. And again, when it was announced, they used the word suspended. And again, Netanyahu has said for whatever reasons he feels he needs to, that yes, he's still trying to find a way to do it. I think it's not going to come back. It's certainly not going to come back if there's a Biden administration, because Biden's clear he opposed it. Even the Trump administration, I think, has been very clear that annexation is not something they would entertain for some time. But most of all, because of the clear understanding that was reached with the UAE leader, Mohammed bin Zayed. He's a proud man. He's a moderate leader. He's somebody who values very much people's word and trust. I just can't really imagine a situation where the Israeli government would run the risk of alienating this new partner, of which so much good feeling is now surrounding the beginning of this normalization process, by proceeding with annexation anyway, when it was very clear it was one or the other, but not both. There's some history to this that I was involved in 2010. You may recall Israel and the UAE already at that point had some very active but quiet security dialogues. In the U.S. and the administration I was involved in, the Obama administration, was up to date on those conversations and occasional participants in those conversations. And in 2010, there was an assassination of a Hamas figure in a hotel in Dubai. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, I think was his name, a Hamas arms dealer. The UAE said Israel was responsible for it. I don't know that Israel's ever taken responsibility for it, but that was the UAE's understanding, that the Mossad had carried out this operation on UAE soil. And Mohammed bin Zayed, same leader of the UAE, was simply livid. He felt so betrayed that this relationship that he had allowed to be cultivated at that time more quietly would be abused by having this very embarrassing event take place on his soil. Maybe if it had taken place without being exposed, he could have gotten away with it. But once it was exposed, he was exposed. And it meant that for almost 2 years, they cut off their dialogue with Israel. And we in the Obama administration were involved in a very, complicated choreography to try to get that relationship back on track. It was eventually restarted. Some understandings were reached about future conduct. Some agreements were reached about some other kinds of defense cooperation. And actually from there, it really took off, in part because of a common focus on Iran, and in part because they just both felt more comfortable being more public about their relationship. So we've really been on a positive trajectory in that relationship since about late 2011, early 2012. But it weathered a very, very difficult episode, which I think would probably be good for any Israeli to bear in mind if they thought that they could reach this deal on annexation when it was clear, on normalization, when it was clear that annexation was ruled out by it, and then go back to annexation anyway. It will come at a very high cost.
So what do your friends in the UAE say? I mean, I assume you were there and you described a little bit part of the things you were involved in the past. If you'd expand on that, do they think, for example, that this is a historic agreement? Is it really like a historic agreement for them as well?
Well, I think they do. I think they're very proud of having decided to take this step in a leadership way, or a way that demonstrates leadership. I think they certainly feel that this is a justified decision to advance their own interests. Of course, as I mentioned, they've had this very long-standing and deep common interest with Israel about combating Iran or preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and getting and supporting terrorist organizations. Also, common interest with Israel in dealing with other extremists in the region, Sunni jihadist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the Muslim Brotherhood. And so that interest has been, long-standing, and they've actually consolidated that a long time ago. They don't necessarily need a normalized relationship to do that kind of cooperation. Of course, now that they will have one, they can do that much more openly and much more actively. You don't have to sneak around and do meetings only in private. You can have the full bureaucracies of these defense establishments and intelligence establishments really working together in a much more open and therefore broader way. So there's a lot to be gained just on the security cooperation side. But they, I think, also view Israel as a huge potential partner in many other fields. In healthcare, obviously, they've already done some joint research, or signed some agreements anyway, for some joint research on COVID treatments. They are major consumers of water technology and renewable energy technologies that are very successful in Israel. Everybody needs cyber technologies and artificial intelligence technologies. They there's of course a great opportunity for tourism and civil aviation, and just about every Israeli I know is planning their family vacation to Dubai once travel is possible, or at least their flight through Dubai on their way to somewhere in Asia. They, I think, really see this as something that advances their interests in many domains. It probably helps them in the United States as well, because, of course, it's well received that Arab states would normalize their relations with Israel. Only two others have done it, and they're both close partners of the United States. The UAE has had some rougher relations of late with the Democrats because of their seeming close relationship with Trump and their participation in the war in Yemen, which has gone very poorly and in which there have been a lot of civilian casualties. And so this might be a little bit of insurance policy for them to have a better story to tell to a Democratic administration if there's a change in November. So they may have some other interests that they're advancing in this way. But I think what it almost, what undergirds all of that is a feeling that they just don't any longer want to have the Palestinian issue be what constrains their being able to advance their own interests. They aren't less committed to helping Palestinians achieve statehood and a two-state solution, and along the dimensions that has previously been discussed in other negotiations. But they signed on, as all Arab states did, to the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, which said the sequence was first two states, then normalization. And it hasn't worked. Lots of reasons it hasn't worked. That's too much history to go into. But I think they felt rather than continuing to wait for more negotiations that don't appear on the horizon, rather than have arguments with the Palestinian leadership, which they often do, rather than dwell on a particular Israeli action, especially if they could pull off the table the one that would have actually killed two states, which is annexation, go ahead, advance their interests, and then continue to be advocates, but now advocates who can sit at the table with Israelis instead of advocates who are boycotting Israelis for two states in that context while pursuing these other interests. And I think they feel that there are others who will follow them. Bahrain, Oman, Sudan have all been talked about. Saudi Arabia, perhaps, although I think it will take longer. They are, they have some different internal politics that they would have to manage, even though I think the Crown Prince leans in this direction. So I think the UAE is feeling quite proud about it, and you saw that they were willing to have this very public, very warm embrace of the delegation that was there over the last couple of days, and I think that's really just the beginning. One other interest, by the way, that they believe that they advanced in it is their ability to purchase an F-35 or a squadron or a group of F-35 aircraft. This is the fifth generation fighter aircraft that the U.S. has built, the most advanced that there is, and that's now a little bit in dispute. We can talk about that if you want to, but that's yet another interest that I think they felt they were able to advance by taking this step.
But do you think the F-35 deal puts Israel in danger in that sense? Is America aware and takes that into consideration, or do you think that's a false alarm?
Well, I think it's a serious concern. Israel has the F-35. They signed an agreement during the Obama administration to receive 50 F-35s. They have about half of that many now, and the others coming over the next 5 years. They are the only Air Force in the Middle East that flies it. It is a totally different platform from any other kind of aircraft, and it adds a significant new dimension to air superiority. And the United States has a commitment, both in policy and in law, to ensure that what's known as Israel's qualitative military edge is sustained. Its ability to have a greater military capability than any army or even coalition of armies that it might face. And so every time the United States has considered previously selling advanced weapons to Arab states, and we've done it many times, including during the Obama administration, F-15s to Saudi Arabia and F-16s at that time to the UAE and some others. It has been accompanied by a very intense discussion and dialogue with Israeli security experts and American security experts to try to understand the impact of such a sale on Israel's qualitative military edge, to ensure that it doesn't cross certain lines. And there are ways of doing that that have to do with quantity, that have to do with how the use restrictions that are put on various equipment, the other systems that are sold in accordance with those systems. It, of course, has to do with Israel's own capabilities. So certainly Israel is more comfortable if there is no other air force in the Middle East that flies the F-35. And I think that's its starting point. I think it's probably hard to imagine that Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't understand that this was what the UAE felt it was getting, and probably got a commitment from the United States. I don't think they would have surprised Netanyahu on that. So I'm not sure his opposition will amount to full-scale campaign against it. But there is a problem here, in that normally a decision like that would have been preceded by those technical discussions about how you would structure a sale like this in a way that doesn't negatively impact Israel's QME, qualitative military edge. And instead, the decision seems to have been made, and now they have to go back and have those conversations. And by the way, that could stretch over into a new administration, which might take another look at the question. So it's less than ideal in some ways. I have to say, I don't think most Israeli, even defense planners, are that worried about the UAE, which is far away, which is a friendly country, which is a stable country. And if it has, some number of F-35s and doesn't get the first of those until a decade after Israel has had its well integrated into its air force, that actually becoming a threat is not the thing that worries them the most, although maybe they think about it a little bit. The one that really worries them more, there are two things, I think. One is that UAE is so close to Iran, and where those F-35s would fly is going to be much more visible to Iran, either on the ground through their own intelligence presence in the UAE or just in the air. It is a stealth aircraft, but obviously there are ways of monitoring it. And that might have some impact on the advantage it gives Israel to have that aircraft if it's ever in a conflict with Iran. But the other one, and maybe this is even more salient, is the precedent it sets for other Arab states to purchase the same F-35. In the past, anything the UAE has acquired, eventually Saudi Arabia has acquired, Egypt has felt they should acquire.
Now I see Annie's comments.
These are other Arab state partners of the United States, and there is a feeling that they are no less entitled to anything that any other Arab state partner in the United States gets. And the F-35 in Saudi Arabia's hands or in Egypt's hands presents a different challenge for Israel geographically and perhaps in terms of the stability of those regimes. I think Amos Gilad, who's the former Minister of Defense official who was really the keeper of the QME discussions with Israel for most of the years I was in government, and he's now at IDC at Herzliya, he was quoted the other day saying, look, he said, all of these governments are friendly governments right now. And so in theory, we shouldn't necessarily be that concerned about, even an advanced weapon in their hands. Having said that, Iran was once a close partner of Israel. Turkey was once a close partner of Israel. And we know in the Middle East that either suddenly, as in the case of Iran, or gradually, as in the case of Turkey, friendly countries can become unfriendly. And if they are in possession of, very advanced weapons, that might be a situation that Israel doesn't want to find itself in. So I think there are solutions to these problems, but unfortunately, I think the decision was front-loaded before the effort to find the solution. So I have some concerns about that.
Okay. Maybe if Biden hints that he will somehow obstruct the F-35 deal, maybe that will get him a vote, a Jewish vote, in a sense. But with that in mind, how much credit do you think Netanyahu really deserves for the UAE agreement? You also mentioned other countries, other Arab countries that might be coming. Would any Israeli prime minister with this specific American administration be able to make this a breakthrough, or do you think this is something special that he deserves credit for?
Well, it's hard to answer the hypothetical. Obviously, whoever's in in office when breakthroughs happen deserves their share of credit, and obviously have played their part in achieving it. Um, and so he certainly deserves it. I think these shifts in the UAE's understanding of its position strategically and the trajectory of this relationship through the last decade means that we might have reached this point, despite, even if there had been other leaders in Israel or the U.S. or both. Even in 2015, I think the UAE became host to an international UN organization called it's a renewable energy organization, the International Renewable Energy Agency, I think it's called. And it has its headquarters in Abu Dhabi. And the Obama administration was actively lobbying, and almost to the point of an ultimatum, that we would only support the placement of that UN agency's headquarters in Abu Dhabi if Israel was able to send a delegation openly to be present at. And so actually since 2015, there has been an open Israeli diplomatic presence in Abu Dhabi, not a direct bilateral relationship, but obviously a mission that can conduct some of those discussions, even though their official mandate was something else. So, we've been on this road for a while, and I'm not sure that, the only person or the only combination of leaders that could have achieved it are Netanyahu and Trump, but they're the ones in office now, and of course they deserve their share of credit. Netanyahu has made a different argument that, it's his contention that only that the Palestinian issue really doesn't matter anymore, and that there was, it shouldn't have held anything back. And now Arab states are finally coming around to that and seeing what Israel has to offer as a partner in security and technology and economic terms. As I mentioned earlier, I think the UAE did sort of reach a point of deciding they didn't want to sublimate their own interest to the Palestinian issue. There may be some truth in it, although I'm not sure it really solves any problem. I mean, it doesn't solve any problem. The Palestinians aren't going anywhere. The reasons for Israel to achieve a two-state solution with the Palestinians are not primarily, or certainly weren't exclusively, about what that would mean for opening its relations with Arab states, although that was certainly considered one of the benefits, and it might still be necessary to get the full benefit of those relationships. But it was first and foremost about Israel's own character, its own Jewish and democratic character, and its standing with democratic nations, not just with Arab nations, including the United States, if it drifts in a direction where it is not really possible to think of it as a Jewish and a democratic state, but as something else, something that's not one of those two. It is fine to say, Arab states don't really care about the Palestinians. I don't think that's fully true, and I think their publics do, and I think they will continue, even those who normalize with Israel, and I hope more do. I'm absolutely for it. Will continue to be advocates, and in some ways they might be oddly more effective advocates, as Egypt and Jordan have tried to be post normalization with Israel. But there's, even if one took that at face value, that they no longer care about the Palestinian issue, I would say there's something else they don't care about. They don't care about Zionism. The UAE does not care that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. The UAE does not care whether Israel lives up to the principles in its Declaration of Independence. The UAE does not care if over time Israel loses its either Jewish or its democratic character. That's not what is keeping a UAE leader up at night. That's not an interest that they are focused on. I think it should be an interest that Israelis focus on, although I try not to tell Israelis what their own interests are. I know it's an interest that I worry about as an American interest, because I think the ability to sustain the U.S.-Israel relationship in the way we have always maintained it, as both one of common values and common interests, or common interests and common values, is very much connected to those fundamental characteristics of Israeli society. So I think I have an interest as an American in making sure two states remains alive and viable and achievable. It's not achievable now, but to keep it realistic, and not the Trump version, which is not a real two-state solution, something that looks a little bit more like what's been envisioned previously. And we might need to be the advocates for that, even if Arab states are saying, they're moving forward, whether it happens or not, in normalizing with Israel, which again, I fully welcome.
Thank you very much. We're coming close to the end. There were a few questions on the chat and some questions that were sent on email. I have a question here from Ken Krupat, and Max, maybe you can also scan the chat and find like one or two questions. So
Okay.
I'll start with Ken's question. Given that it seems highly unlikely that any Israeli government will give up the old city or abandon the large settlement, isn't it fair to say that the Trump-Kushner plan is closer to an eventual resolution than any previous plan, even if the Palestinians won't currently accept it? How will Biden's approach differ from the Trump-Kushner plan? If it will be a return to Obama's approach, isn't it fair to say that it is flawed and even failed way of dealing with the problem? And he has a follow-up question. Will Biden-Harris be able to resist pressure from the progressive wing of the party to isolate Israel and place all of responsibility and pressure on Israel to make concessions?
Okay, there's a lot there. So I don't think the Trump plan is a viable solution. I don't think it's remotely implementable as a plan, because I don't think any Palestinian leader will ever engage on it. It doesn't describe a two-state solution in any meaningful sense. It describes Israel's annexation of 30% of the West Bank, all settlements, not just the large blocks, the Jordan Valley, and leaving isolated islands of limited Palestinian autonomy that don't have even a modicum of the sovereignty characteristics of a state. And so I don't believe it's a viable solution. I think it's what you get when the United States talks to one side. And that's basically what happened. After the United States moved the embassy to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the embassy to Jerusalem, steps I supported, by the way, the Palestinians kind of cut off contact with the U.S., diplomatic contact at least. That was a mistake, surely. But you know, if you want to be a mediator in a conflict, you do have to have some ability to talk to both sides. And the United States never overcame that. They've never been able to resume a diplomatic discussion with the Palestinians. You can blame the Palestinians for that, but it also leaves the United States in this position where they said, well, okay, we'll talk to one side and we'll write a plan that reflects the interests of one side. And I think in any negotiation or any conflict that can only be resolved through negotiations, that is not a very successful basis on which to create a solution. So I don't think it's a viable outcome. Now that doesn't mean that, you know, previous proposals were perfect, and since I don't speak for the Biden campaign, and I don't think they have even articulated what exactly a Biden plan, if there is one, would look like. And there might not be one, by the way. There might be smarter to say we aren't going to push for negotiations, at least while the same leaders who have been through several failed negotiations and clearly mistrust each other are still in place. It might be better to put in place some structures that try to keep two states viable for a later negotiation. But again, I'm speculating very much. So what the Biden campaign has said is that one of the things that it would do is reverse the steps the Trump administration have taken that have made it impossible to have any relationship with the Palestinians. It doesn't mean we return the embassy to Jerusalem. The embassy will remain in Jerusalem, but resuming diplomatic contact would be reversed. Returning a consulate that has its own separate ability to conduct diplomacy with the Palestinian Authority would be reversed. Trying to find a way, there's some legal issues, but find a way to reopen the PLO office in Washington would be reversed. And resuming assistance programs that have been designed to support the Palestinian economy and give some and humanitarian relief and give some stability, which, by the way, have always been supported by Israel, including by the IDF, and not the aid that has been withheld because of what's called the Taylor Force Act, the aid withheld because of the salaries paid to Palestinian terrorists in Israeli prisons. The law that requires that money to be withheld, which I support and Biden supports and was a practice of the Obama administration even before the law passed, actually does not apply to many of the streams of aid that the administration cut off, the Trump administration cut off. Streams that don't go to the Palestinian Authority. They just go to the Palestinian people. They're humanitarian and they're economic, and they are both good for stability in the present, and they help sustain a viable economic structure and hospitals and other institutions that would, of course, be the building blocks of a Palestinian state. And security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians. All of that money has been basically cut off or mostly suspended by the Trump administration, and I think the Biden administration would certainly reverse that. But its overall philosophy, I think, again, speaking for myself here, is two states still needs to be the goal. It needs to be a realistic version of that, something that meets Israel's fundamental needs and rights for security, for legitimacy, full recognition of its legitimacy as a Jewish state, of no right of return of Palestinians into main Israel's borders, and those are fundamental, but also something that fundamentally meets Palestinians' rights to statehood and dignity and sovereignty and self-determination. And there would, of course, be limits on that sovereignty, demilitarization and the like, but something that a Palestinian leader can defend to their own people. Now, if that is kept alive, and hopefully eventually with maybe perhaps different leaders, and maybe with support of some of these Arab states who have normalized, by the way, I think there's some real opportunities here for the UAE and others to get involved as positive actors with money and with other forms of political support to support that very goal. That it's not something that should be ruled out, but maybe not something that should be pushed for immediately. Maybe in the early years you do it in sort of smaller steps on the ground that help sustain that, and that is absolutely achievable, viable, but of course, as I said much earlier, necessary, because the alternatives are that eventually some version of the Trump plan or just some long-term extension of the status quo takes place, and eventually a Palestinian Authority is not really sustainable. It's something that Palestinian leaders can no longer defend their own people, don't have the legitimacy if there's no horizon for statehood and self-determination. And eventually when it collapses or melts away, perhaps after Abbas leaves, it's not clear what would be the trigger for it, but it seems like, to me, that would be the much more likely scenario. Israel is drawn back inexorably into full control of all the people and all the territory west of the Jordan River, and its Jewish and democratic characteristics are put in irresolvable conflict with one another. So, and that, again, has impact for the U.S. as a relationship.
Thank you. Max, do you have one or maybe two?
Sorry, before Max's question, I know Ken asked one more question, which I'll just take 30 seconds on, which is, the question about is there a pull from the far left in the Democratic Party? All I can say is Joe Biden has worked on these issues for his entire career. He wears his love of Israel on his sleeve. He's the most ardent defender of Israel's security and the U.S. assistance to it his whole career, including in the Obama years, which he helped with the MOU and everything else. He knows his views on this. No one's going to move him off those views on it. He won the primary. The other, let's say, faction of the party didn't win the primary. The platform that was written for the party, which I worked on as a member of the platform committee, reflected his views. So I think those are all pretty good signs about what will be the direction and the main influence on the policy. Sorry, Max.
Okay, so there've been a couple of people asking questions, and Dan Aronovitz, I'm going to unmute you, and why don't you ask the question? Dan, are you there?
Yeah.
We can't hear you, Dan.
Max, which
Dan, go ahead and ask your question.
Dan, which Dan are you talking to?
Dan Aronovitz. Okay.
Because I don't think he's answering.
All right.
So I'm here. Dan, I wanted to find out if Biden does win the election, do you see yourself in a role in the administration? And to follow up, would there be a possibility of you coming back as Israeli ambassador?
Thanks for the question. It's a good question for me to duck. I really focused on winning this election, my candidate winning this election, and really not thinking about anything beyond that. I had planned to spend a good chunk of this year in the States helping the campaign and doing some of my other projects there. And obviously that didn't happen because of COVID, and I'm doing it anyway because we all do it by Zoom now. If I were to go, there's nowhere to go. There's no meetings. There's no rallies. There's no door-to-door meeting of voters. You just do everything by computer. So I could sit in Washington and do exactly what I'm doing now. So I'm active. I'm involved, but I haven't given a moment's thought to anything after November 3rd.
Thanks, Dan. So just a question, and it's a chance to say hi to Annie. And Annie, we're thinking of you. We hope Moshe is doing okay. Annie, I want you to unmute and ask your question. Annie, you there?
Yeah, okay. Hi, Dan. There was a rumor circulating in the television here that that Biden is very frail mentally and cognitively, and that the rumor continues that he's probably not going to survive the entire first term if he wins, and that Kamala Harris is going to take over, and that's not going to be very good for Israel. What's your opinion?
I think all of those rumors are completely unfounded. Joe Biden is. I've spent some time in these kinds of settings with him. He is hale. He is hearty. He is on the ball. This is his campaign. Anybody who watched his speech at the Democratic convention could see this is somebody with vigor and full control of his. Of his faculties. And, this is not surprising that the Republicans will try to use this spin about him. Of course, he's 77 or will soon be 78. So, he has, he would be the oldest president to be elected, but there's actually no evidence of that. He is somebody who has spoken with a stutter or worked to overcome a stutter since he was a child. He's been very open about that. Actually, it was an incredibly moving moment in the Democratic convention where a young 13-year-old boy he met during the primaries in New Hampshire, who has a stutter, spoke through his stutter about how Joe Biden has been helping him overcome his stutter. And so now and then he stumbles over words. He has the lost end of a sentence as I do, even without a stutter. I often find myself doing that. But there's just zero evidence that he's not all there and ready to go. He hasn't said anything about 1 term, 2 terms. That's obviously something he would, I guess, decide much later. But he did choose, I think, a stellar running mate. Kamala Harris is extremely impressive. She's brilliant. She's extremely energetic. She's extremely charismatic. She connects with lots of different voter groups, African Americans, of course. She's also half Indian American. She's got an amazing American story of 2 immigrant parents and really kind of living that American dream. She's been a prosecutor. She's been a senator. She has traveled to Israel. I met her on her trip to Israel. She's traveled to Israel more than once, but she traveled to Israel once as a senator. And I met her when she came here in 2017. I've briefed her in her office in Washington. Her husband is Jewish. I think it made people know that. Her positions on Israel are really both Joe Biden's positions. There was no compromise there. There was no need to sort of convince one to adopt the other's views. She's as strongly committed, and just said this on a fundraiser that I was involved in last week, and it was reported publicly that the aid to Israel is absolutely unconditional. It's not going to be tied to other decisions. That the commitment to Israel's security is of the highest priority, and she holds those positions no less than Joe Biden does. So I hope Joe Biden serves a whole term, and if he wants to, a whole second term. If at any point after those 4 years or 8 years we end up with President Kamala Harris, I'll be delighted, and I think she'll be a terrific friend and supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship as well.
So I'd like to ask Judy Katzen maybe to ask her question. And Judy, if you unmute, go ahead, and then I guess we can wrap it up, Rav Tzvika.
It was just something that came up when you were talking about the UAE agreement. Just curious whether anyone thinks that that agreement would be something that would sway American Jews towards Trump.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's good news, and I give credit to those who were involved in it, and I celebrate it, and there may be a signing ceremony on the White House lawn sometime in the next few weeks, and, any administration that presides over a foreign policy accomplishment during an election, will get some benefit from that, and I don't think anybody can begrudge that. And to the extent that Jewish voters are following us and care about it, it's obviously good news. I'd say a couple of things. One is everything we know about most American Jewish voters is that Israel is not actually near the top of their issues that they vote on. They vote on healthcare and the economy, and now COVID and racial justice and a lot of the other issues, climate change, that motivate most other American voters. Maybe there are some who do, and maybe some in that narrow swing that can be influential in a very close election in a key swing state. So I don't want to suggest it has zero impact, but I think its impact is going to be limited, pretty limited. I certainly don't see any kind of massive reorientation, and that's because at the end of the day, there's almost no foreign policy issue, with the possible exception of some things that relate to China. But even that really are going to succeed in pushing themselves onto the national agenda this year. The national agenda is clear. It's about the pandemic. It's about the economic crisis. It's about the racial justice reckoning. It's about whether or not we have a leader who has the personal characteristics and character and commitment to facts and science and norms and laws to see us through these crises. And, there are people who believe Trump is the leader for that. I think they're wrong. But that's really what I think there are more people, and I hope in the end there will be more people who think Biden is the leader for that. But I really think that's going to be the defining characteristic of this election. And news moves awful fast. If they do a signing ceremony in the 3rd or 4th week of September, and there are 3 presidential debates and a vice presidential debate, and the whole month of October, and the whole story of how the early voting is going and the mail-in voting is going, and a vaccine, the search for a vaccine, and the fights over the post office playing out over the 5-6 weeks to election day, I think it will be almost forgotten that there was a signing ceremony at the White House lawn. By the time most people actually cast their ballot. So again, it's a great thing. I'm for it. If they get credit for it, that's fine. I think it will have a very, very limited effect on actual voting.
Thank you so much, Dan. This was really fascinating. I now realize what I missed most about, the entire congregation of Hod Vadar gathering Shabbat at Kiddush, and you talked to all of us about what's going on in the world and in America. So you gave us a lot of Kiddush material we were missing for the last few months.
Well, my great pleasure. Thank you, Tzvika, for the opportunity, and it's great to see everybody, and I miss you all.
Thank you very much. Kol Tuv and Shalom.
Bye, Dan.